program how many rows should actually be in that table, how many dates have been added to the table. But what is underscore objects dot count? Where did that come from? Yeah, it probably holds the information for the rows because, again, recall the difference between C and V, controller and view. The view may very well render what looks like a table, but if there's any data that you're rendering, it's the controller's job in life to actually keep track of that and just pass it to the view. So we shouldn't be storing those dates in the view per se. We should be storing all of those dates after every click of the plus button somewhere inside of my controller and then just handing it to the view. So underscore objects, if we glance back at the top of the file, was actually declared up here. And I've declared an NS mutable array. What's the difference between mutable array and NS array? You can modify it. So it's mutable in that you can change it. You can add, remove to and from it. So I've done at interface master view controller open paren close paren. So again, we've already did that, I thought. In the .h file, we had at interface master view controller open curly brace. Why have we repeated ourselves and added these parentheses? For it to be private, or to the illusion of privacy. So we've used an unnamed category here. So recall that categories are just ways of grouping related functions, but the world as a convention has adopted it as a means of approximating the idea of private methods and private data members, private only in the sense that they are not being declared to the world in the .h file, because .h files can be imported by other people, which means other people would see our implementation details, but they're nonetheless adding it to the class master view controller because it's inside of this declaration. So we apparently have an NS mutable array underscore objects, but where is that guy first used? Well, let me scroll down and scroll down and scroll down, and it looks like, let's see, where's our underscore objects? Ah, there we go. Exactly. So here we have a method, insert new object, colon. So what do you think is inducing this method to be called, based on what we've seen thus far? So hitting that plus button. And how was that done? Was it done in Interface Builder or? So insert new object. So again, let's just do a little highlight and copy. Let's see where, oh, interesting. So view did load. We didn't finish that story. We and Apple did not use Interface Builder, it seems, to wire things up. They've done it all in low-level code. So when view did load, we started telling that story in terms of the left button bar item. If we go a little deeper, notice what's happening here. When we declare this UI bar button item and allocate it and initialize it, we are choosing, this is a constant. This very long word, UI bar button system item add, is just the atrociously named constant for the plus icon. That's all that's doing. It's aesthetic. But we're saying target colon self action at selector insert new object. So first of all, what is action colon at selector insert new object doing functionally? Exactly. When some action happens, which in this case is going to be the touching of the button. That's the default behavior for one of these buttons when it's clicked by a user's finger. What message do you want to send to an object? You want to send this message, insert new object, or put another way, what method do you want to call? And to which object will that message be passed? On which object will that method be called? The target. So target colon self means this class, this object, and that is why, slightly more lower in the screen, we have an implementation of the method that we want to call. So as an aside, the reason that we have this funky syntax, at selector, open paren, close paren, is so that it's clear what the name of the message is that you want to send, because we've seen methods that have colons in them, and it would just get very complicated, if not impossible, to parse the string if you had action colon, insert new object colon, which colon belongs to what. So that's the idea of at selector. It's just a syntactic thing. So that means when you click that plus button, this guy is actually called. So in answer to the question, where is the objects NS mutable array coming from, we instantiate it lazily. The first time we need it, we check, does it exist? If it doesn't exist, that is, if underscore objects equals nil, we're going to go ahead and instantiate an NS mutable array, and then we are going to start populating it. And at this point, if you start to read through the code, you'll see a couple new features. There's this notion of index path, which is something specific to these UI table views. A path is just a tuple of numbers, two numbers together, a section and a row. So an index path is just an object that contains those two values, and if you keep reading further in the code, you'll see that this is the function that actually does the generation of and insertion of a date into that actual table view. Yeah?
A question about, say we would have a property for the object's variable.
Okay.
Would it be faster to use the object with the underscore?
Good question. So suppose we had declared objects as a property. There would be a couple of implications. One, we could do self.objects and mutate it that way. On the other hand, so could anyone else who happens to be importing, for instance, my .h file. If we declared the property there, though we don't have to declare it there, you would get some marginally additional functionality, because by default the setter and or the getter will often have additional code in them. For instance, if you've declared it to be atomic, it will have some additional code. With the setter will by default make sure that you never set an object equal to itself, which can do some bad things circularly. So you would get some protections, but you pay a price. What's the downside, would you conjecture, of using a property to implement this container as opposed to just declaring a raw pointer like this? It takes longer, and we're talking, negligible amount of time for something like this, where clearly I, the human, am the bottleneck for any slowness in this application, how quickly I can press. But in theory, that's why they've done it in this way. We're the only ones using the property, not the rest of the world. I know how to use it. I just don't need the marginal overhead of a setter and/or getter. But a good question. Okay, so let's not spend too much time on the particulars of this specific application, but let's just scroll through, lastly, the other methods that might be here. So there's this one, table view, cell for row at index path, because this one method actually reveals an interesting design pattern that's not uncommon, especially for performance reasons. So table view, cell for row at index path, and then it's given an index path. The purpose in life of this method, if we read the documentation for the UI table view parent class, is that it is supposed to return a cell, a UI table view cell, so an object that represents a cell in a table configured exactly as we want it. And by configured, I mean what text do you want for the cell, what buttons do you want on the cell, what behavior do you want for that cell. So in short, this method is called when rendering this row, then this row, then this row, then this row, then this row. It is my job to tell iOS how I want each row to look and behave. So what's interesting, though, about this implementation is the following. One, we have this static pointer declared here, cell identifier, that points to a string that's statically declared as quote-unquote cell. This is completely arbitrary. It could be quote-unquote foo or bar or any word there, but it's going to be used in the following way. Down here, I declare UI table view cell, table view DQ reusable cell with identifier quote-unquote cell, quote-unquote foo, whatever word you've chosen. So what is that doing? Well, I'm checking if cell equals nil. That means that there apparently was no reusable cell in my queue. So nothing came back. And so what do I proceed to do? Well, it looks like a common paradigm here. UI table view cell, allocate it, then initialize it with some long, crazy named constant, and also give it a reuse identifier of quote-unquote cell, or quote-unquote foo, whatever word you've chosen. Then lastly, change the accessory type to be UI table view cell accessory disclosure indicator. What is that? It's like the little eye icon or similar on the screen. All right, so, or rather the little arrow that points to the right that we saw in the table view when we were in the app. Then we proceed to do what? We grab the object at that particular row. We then update the text label on that cell to be whatever the description is of that object. So in short, the object that we put in the object we put in objects was essentially a date, and then we're just adding that to the descriptive text on the cell itself, and then we return the cell. So most of that was just configuration details, maybe new in terms of the code we're seeing, but not all that interesting, except for this if condition here. What do you think the purpose is of the relative complexity of these several lines? Why this queue? Why this reusable thing? What's going on?
Make sure you don't overwrite a cell, or just make sure it's unique.
Okay, so make sure you don't overwrite a cell, make sure it's unique. True, but we could do that by just allocating a new cell for every one of the dates in this table, or every one of the words that I want to put in this table. Why else might I be introducing this complexity of some kind of queue of reusable cells? Want to change the value inside. So that's true, but why? What's the motivation? Let me press further. Suppose that you can view 10 cells on the screen at once based on the height of your iPhone and the height of your font, and you have allocated, let me say, if you only can display 10 rows at a time, but you've got 100 dates because you've hit that button 100 times, technically only 10 of those cells